All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Free American Hour. I'm your host, Clay Douglas. And my guest today is Frosty Wooldridge. If you're on the internet, you may and should be aware of him. This is a guest I'm very pleased on bringing up because, well, I've met Frosty, and we've ridden together, and I really appreciate what you did. You crossed the whole country when you came through Albuquerque, and we got to get together for a little while. Welcome, Frosty.
We certainly did. I don't know if the website's still up, but back in 2006 we did 20,300 miles, 48 states, 48 capitals in 14 weeks, and we crossed this country to speak to the American people. It was called the 21st Century Paul Revere Ride.us, and I think it's still up as far as a website. And in that great ride of 20,000 miles across America, we got to speak on 96 television interviews, 90 newsprint, and 40 radio shows to really alert the nation that this country is being overwhelmed by mass immigration, both legally and illegally. And the real tragedy is that it's about to add 100 million more people to the United States of America within the next 24 years, by 2035, and then beyond that, in the next 40 years, it will add another 138 million. So that's how fast this thing is going. It's an overpopulation juggernaut that most Americans don't seem to understand the long-term ramifications. But if you look at places like California or even Arizona, you're seeing the present-day ramifications of overloading, whether it's water shortages, whether you see the gas prices that are exploding, the pollution across the cities, or you're talking about the gridlock in the cities as far as car traffic. I mean, LA is just a horrific nightmare, along with places like Dallas and Houston and Chicago. Certainly New York City, Atlanta is a nightmare. All these places are overloaded. And then you start talking about the schools that have been degraded, Clay. We have 7,000 American teenagers drop out of high school every day now, one every 26 seconds. That equals to about 1.2 million per year are 18 years old. They don't have a high school degree. They're hitting the streets, functionally illiterate. And I'm a math and science teacher, and I can tell you, how do you think we are going to continue as a first world country when we have so much illiteracy? How much illiteracy? About 42 million Americans can't read, write, or perform simple mathematics. Another 50 million Americans can't read past the 4th grade level. So as you can imagine, we are in a lot of trouble right now, and yet we're still pumping in 3.1 million immigrants into this country every year now, and yet we have 15 million Americans unemployed and 43 million Americans who are subsisting on food stamps. So, Clay, we've got a problem, and yet really the Congress and the President are absolutely doing nothing to solve it.
Now, you point on your website, which is excellent, by the way, that's FrostyWoolbridge1.wmv, that much like the Titanic that sank on April 15th, I wonder if that date was chosen. 1912. The United States stands at a critical juncture in the history of our nation. Few realize it, but like the Titanic, this nation smashed into a piece of legislation in 1965 that was never asked for and approved by the American public. Could you elucidate on that a little bit?
Well, I can. One of the things that happened in 1965 stems from a former Teddy Kennedy senator from Massachusetts who tossed together a piece of legislation that changed the immigration policies from 150,000 per year from compatible countries in Europe and started injecting about 1.5 million immigrants every year into the United States that has now added, since 1965, a total of 100 million people. And unfortunately, that 100 million people made this society, this civilization, unsustainable. It jumped it from 193 million people in 1964 to well over 312 million right now. And the real tragedy, or certainly the ironic tragedy of that is Teddy Kennedy wanted to save the world, help the world, and take all the destitute and the poverty-stricken from third world countries and bring them to America to give them the American dream. Well, it worked out all right for the most part, but now it's not working out so well, because what's happening is we're finding that these immigrants are from third world countries with third world cultures, with third world illiteracy, and unfortunately they are downgrading the educational systems across America, and they are simply latching on to the welfare systems of the Great Society, and you're seeing horrific consequences in the ghettos that are becoming cyclical and entrenched. To give you an example, today 68% of African American children are being brought up by single African American mothers. The fathers have flown the coop, didn't come back, haven't stood their ground, haven't taken responsibility for these children. That's 68%, ladies and gentlemen. And that's part of the billions of dollars that are being paid out every year in aid to dependent children, to food stamps, assisted housing, medical care. And what it's creating is a whole new entrenched poverty class. If you look at what's happening with, we've got 15 million unemployed in this country, 43 million on food stamps, and yet we have a Congress and a Senate and a House and certainly the President, the last 5 presidents, who are continuing to inject this 3.1 million immigrants into this country every year. And so that legislation, that 1965 Immigration Reform Act, is what added 100 million people, and right now we're on course to add another 100 million people by 2035. That's exactly a minimum of 24 years from now. And the environmental consequences, the sociological consequences, the linguistic consequences, the incompatible cultures that are being injected into this country simply are moving this country away from being an America as we have known it to a polyglot, a hyphenated America that will be non-functional and is totally dysfunctional, whether it's economically, linguistically, culturally. It's actually creating many more separations and much more separation within itself. And as resources become more scarce, and certainly as the contentious situation between all of these different ethnic tribes becomes more contentious, you're going to see the United States suffer tremendous internal conflict, and that's what that bill that Teddy Kennedy passed. And mind you, no one ever debated that bill. He just got passed on us without any debate. And nothing has changed since then, except that this country is just becoming more and more unsustainable.
Charlotte Iserbyt did a book called Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. And there's a teacher, I've been pretty critical of the public fool system, Frosty. I mean, it's like it's more indoctrination to get you to the idea of going to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, working in the factory, and doing what the boss says, rather than education. And as a matter of fact, my son brought home a textbook from 1946, a civics textbook, and it didn't have anything in there about our republic, but it had 10 pages on our democracy. I also don't. One other thing too. When I went to school, and I'm one of those high school dropouts, working on my master's degree right now, political science. But when I was going to school, they didn't teach us what communism was. They told us it was bad. We had a Cold War for 50 years, and against communism, but they didn't tell us what it was. And maybe I speculate that the reason for that is that every plank on the Communist Manifesto is intact in America today, including number 9 corporate farms, if you can say Monsanto. So, what is the situation? Why aren't our schools teaching us what you are saying right now.
Well, I remember as a teacher in the 70s myself, I had to pass all of these kids up to the next grade level, whether they performed at the late grade level they were in or not. I called it at the time affirmative action grading, and then that affirmative action grading turned out to be an affirmative action high school diploma, which they can then move into from the Lyndon Baines Johnson Great Society into an affirmative action job. And when you put somebody into a job through affirmative action, they have no qualifications. And if you'll notice, those kinds of jobs, answering the phone, doesn't take anybody with much more than a double-digit IQ to answer the phone. Security guards became big. If you look at all the security jobs that are out there right now, it's by minorities and immigrants. They essentially get paid to stand around and do nothing. There's no productivity. There's no a contribution into the society, into our civilization. And then as more and more of these people found out about food stamps and welfare and assisted housing and easy free jobs and little work and so forth, we've created this massive welfare loading on this country, and it just continues to grow. And as I said, we are pumping in 3.1 million immigrants every year into this country, and that number is so unsustainable on so many levels, and yet that's what we're doing to ourselves.
Frosty, I've heard that Europeans, Scandinavians, are having trouble getting into this country, and yet our borders are open, and except for Arizona, they seem to be able to come up here and live off our welfare for nothing. So is this an attack on the white European, the Anglo-Saxons, whatever, the Caucasians?
Well, it's an offshoot. What I think with Teddy Kennedy, who never stepped into a ghetto or never stepped into a multicultural situation in his life, was attempting to do at the time was to bring some kind of equity to the immigration equation, but instead he just simply started importing highly incompatible cultures, highly incompatible ways of life, and certainly highly incompatible religions. And pardon me. The problem is that the incompatibilities are they're now starting to manifest not only in Europe with highly contentious situations with the Muslims and the Europeans, but here in the United States, we're transforming this country from the Western European culture to a Hispanic Mexican culture, and as anybody knows, if you look at all the Mexican cultures and the Latino cultures, you could sit and say, "Wow, this is terribly prejudicial." If you just look at those cultures, is Mexico a successful culture? Well, if it was a successful culture, you wouldn't see 12 to 14 million Mexicans now living in the United States to come here for a better life. They fled that culture, they fled that country to get away from the kind of corruption, the kinds of lack of jobs, the lack of decent living, and came here. And so unfortunately, though, they are remanifesting the same problem here. And if you look at the flunk-out dropout rates in Houston and Dallas and Phoenix and L.A. and most of California, you'll see that the educational systems have been destroyed by all of those immigrants that have come in because they simply don't have the academic ability or the cultural propensity for performing well in the school systems. And so you're seeing the United States transforming out of academic excellence into academic essentially poverty or mediocrity.
Now, you talk about overpopulation being the main problem, and the elite that rule us, and I think have enslaved us. I'll get your opinion on that too. You know, I think this is the banksters that fund both sides of every conflict and control it and manipulate it with their control on propaganda or TV. They don't call it programming for nothing, but they have looked at this problem. I mean, these are the people that believe they are so intelligent and so well positioned that they can run the world and not have to, you know, follow the orders of the people and the wishes of the people or do anything good on the people. But they have it actually written in stone that that they know of this problem that you're speaking of overpopulation, and they want to reduce the world's population to a manageable 500 million. And I'm assuming that would be 499 million slaves and 1 million pharaohs or elite. That's called the Georgia Guidestones. They actually put it in stone, wrote it in stone like the Ten Commandments. What about that?
Well, here's another aspect of immigration that most Americans don't understand or appreciate. Right now, the world population is around 6.9 billion. Sometime around June or July, it's going to hit 7 billion. That's B as in boy, billion. And that number is expected to go to somewhere between 9.2 and 10 billion within the next 40 years. Ladies and gentlemen, pure mathematics will tell you that we have a finite planet. And if you understand that, then you understand that the human race, like any other species, is absolutely governed by the laws of nature. In other words, how much water, how much food, how much resource. And when you have a finite planet and you keep adding unlimited human population levels, you all have heard of deer crashes because they outstrip the food supply or of their area. You know, again, I'll give you an example. Do you think you could have an unlimited population of humanity, let's say of 1 billion people on the continent of Australia? Well, today Australia only has 21 million people, and they're suffering right now because they don't have enough water. And since I cycled around Australia, I can tell you firsthand that Australia is 96% desert. So its carrying capacity is limited to even less than 21 million. It would be better if they were 10 million. Now, you'll hear all these other things about Agenda 21 from the UN and the United Nations. You'll hear about the elites who want to cull the American, the human herd, if you will, the human population down. Well, one way or the other, whether the human race gracefully by birth control, which of course is used by 99% of American women. We've been having 2.03 children per woman in this country since 1970. So we have used birth control, and we have maintained a stable population. The same in France. In fact, they've been 1.5 to 1.7 or so. In France is the average number of births per woman. But what you're not having across the globe, Clay, is that these third world countries like Muslims, Latinos, and all that, Africans, are not using birth control, and they are growing by 80 million annually. 80 million net gain, and not only that, you have to understand this: 57 million people die every year around the world. 57 million. Not only is the third world adding another 57 million to babies to replace the 57 million that die, but it's adding another 80 million babies, or 137 million altogether, to the world population. That's 137 million new babies that have to be fed, housed, watered, and use resources to maintain them on this planet. And we're going to add another 2 to 3 billion within the next 40 years. Something's got to give, folks. Something's got to give. So the elites may think that they're going to do, population culling or whatever, but I'm going to tell you the final population arbiter is Mother Nature herself. And right now, 18 million human beings starve to death on this planet every year. 18 million. And of course, everybody here in this country keeps thinking that, well, we've got all the land, we've got all the water, we've got everything else. Well, we don't. It's called carrying capacity, and every continent has a limited carrying capacity. Does anybody know how much the carrying capacity of Antarctica is? And I live down there and I work down there, and I can tell you this. It's zero. Why? Because it's all ice. There's no soil. You can't have anything. You could have water if you wanted to melt the snow, but you have to talk about carrying capacity, and no one's talking about that. In fact, this country runs from it. You'll hear everybody in this country, well, population's not a problem. Well, I can tell you, here in the United States, population is a problem. There are water shortages already in Georgia, in Florida, also in Arizona, certainly in California, in Nevada, and yet the places like California expect to add 20 million more people within the next 30 years. In fact, California right now is growing by 1,700 people per day, net gain. It's adding 400 cars to the highways every day, net gain. I mean, just do the math, folks. 20 years, 30 years from now, at 600,000, 602,000 added to California net gain every year. That's 20 million more people in a state that's so overcrowded, so overwhelmed, so completely gridlocked, air polluted, you name it. Tell me if you think that that's all going to work out in a positive way. So we've got more than just a population problem, an immigration problem. We've got ecological problems that at some point will become so irreversible and unsolvable that we're all going to be literally facing horrific consequences on multiple levels. And yet the American people, almost like they have got Alzheimer's, they simply sit here and ignore all this stuff coming at us, and they want to blame this, that, and the next thing. Wait till the gasoline hits $10 a gallon. Wait till it hits $15 a gallon. In fact, there's a new book out. I did a review on it by Chris Steiner from Forbes magazine, and my book, America on the Brink, the next added 100 million Americans. I talk about energy in the book, but Chris Steiner has all the science on this thing, and he says gasoline's going to $20 a gallon. And if you look at when I was a kid, it was 19 cents a gallon. I could fill up my Volkswagen for $2 and go 400 miles. Well, now I just filled up my car for $48, and I still have a 4-cylinder car, but it's not costing me $2. It's costing me, what, 10 times, 20 times more than it cost me back then. So gasoline is also going to go higher, and it's going to change the way we operate. And we're going to be thankful just to put food on the table the way this thing's going.
If you're selling gasoline, if that's the way you're making your living, pumping oil out of the ground, converting it to gasoline, and selling it to gasoline, then wouldn't you want more people driving?
Well, yeah, of course. Anybody would want, a person who's selling gasoline wants to have maximum profits and so forth.
What I'm getting at, Frosty, here is that it's the banking, and Thomas Jefferson actually warned us about it. He said if you ever allow a private bank to issue your money, the banks and the corporations that spring up around them will leave your children homeless in the land that we conquered. And since the Federal Reserve has taken over, which is, of course, on the Communist Manifesto, too, central bank and heavily progressive graduated income tax, the population has been growing for the last 100 years, and we still, in the last 100 years, there's been more people killed in wars, by wars, than at any other time in history. So it's like this whole crisis is being created rather than handled it, and they're creating these crises and letting these. I've talked to Border Patrol agents, said we could stop this, we could stop the drugs, we could stop the illegals, but our superiors won't let us. And we've run into the same thing here in Arizona. They're threatening the sheriffs that are trying to enforce the law that we got in Arizona about illegals.
Well, that's correct. We could stop the drug war immediately. Do you notice that the drug war has now gone on since 1971, when Nixon put it into gear, has now gone on for 40 years. And we've been spending $80 billion a year. Well over $1 trillion in 40 years has gone on for the DEA, the drug enforcement that's going on in this country. But has the war stopped? Has the war been won? Well, of course it hasn't been. As a matter of fact, I would encourage all of you to go to my brother Howard's website. It's citizensopposingprohibition.org, and he is a former cop. And what he's trying to do is take a new path. We need to legalize all drugs. Simply legalize them, and then tax them and regulate them and dispense them to anyone over the age of 18 or 21 or whatever, so that it's no longer an issue of illegality, but it's no longer an issue of law. It's a civil issue, and it's a medical issue. And it's been happening over in Europe now for over 20 years. The drugs are legalized over there. Heroin, you can go in and get your heroin shot, and it's cut down a crime 90%. 90%. So the fact is, people are going to take drugs. They do drugs. This whole country's been doing drugs. There's 1 million prescriptions for Valium every week in this country. Prozac, millions of prescriptions. People are taking all sorts of drugs. I mean, go to any drugstore, go to any grocery store, and you got drugs coming out of our ears. And yet these illegal drugs are no different than any of the other drugs. And in fact, marijuana has killed just about nobody compared to alcohol, which kills more people than all other drugs combined. And cigarettes kill 450,000 Americans every year. So what's the point of having a war on drugs when those drugs are affecting such a minor, and it's a choice. It's a choice. So the best thing to do in the final analysis is stop the war on drugs.
That's right.
And stop wasting. We're building more prisons than we're building colleges.
That's right.
We're building, and in Texas, I think it built 1 or 2 colleges in the last 20 years, but it's built something like 25 or 26 prisons. And we've got 2.3 million Americans in prison right now. So what a waste of time.
One in every 31 Americans is in prison, on parole, or on probation right now. And yet our prisons, the illegal aliens that come up here, they use them to carry the drugs across the border.
Right.
And in my book, Mystery Babylon, I detailed the whole story of Operation Watchtower, which was a joint CIA-Mossad operation. They built radio guide towers in Colombia to guide over 100 planes into Albrook Air Force Base, and the cargo was cocaine. So the CIA and Mossad are in the drug. They are the drug dealers. And Frosty, you know, if I could go out, if I want to smoke pot, and I can go out in the backyard and put a seed in there, and go out and nip a bud off occasionally and smoke it, what law am I breaking? And if we could all do that, what good would it be to be in a drug cartel? We wouldn't have any drug cartels, and I don't believe there's any drug cartels anyway. Now, I happen to have done time in a Texas penitentiary back when marijuana was a life sentence in Texas, and I met people that were in jail for a life sentence for smoking a joint. I just had Governor Gary Johnson on my show a few days ago, and he said the same thing. You know, legalize the drugs. You know, if you want to go over and sit in that corner and die and kill yourself with heroin, knock yourself out. It'll just help on the population problem without the government having to come in and do it. But if the government is using our soldiers to guard the poppies, to turn them into heroin, and then you know, shipping them over here through CIA planes into little airports like Mena, Arkansas, to sell them to Americans, and if you speak out, then we can confiscate your property and everything for whatever you got in your pocket there, son. And it's like this monstrous racket, as Smedley Butler referred to it. if your government is selling you the drugs, and your government is sponsoring this, then they certainly it makes it real easy to find you and arrest you if you are partaking of their product. This is insanity.
You got it.
This is insanity to me, and for